Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back in time to a different kind of quiet. Imagine you're standing on a muddy, unpaved street in a small medieval town in, say, England or France, sometime around the 13th century. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a gentle wash of purples and dusky oranges, and the crisp autumn air is beginning to carry the distinct smell of wood smoke and damp earth. You can hear the low, contented hum of the community settling down. Dogs are barking lazily. A distant blacksmith's hammer gives one last, tired thunk on an anvil, and the voices of your neighbors drift through open doorways. You're bundled in rough woolen clothes, your stomach full of a simple dinner of bread and pottage. As you look down the street, you see doors being latched and shutters being pulled closed. You probably won't survive this. By the way, not because of any great danger, but because the pace of life was so profoundly different. It was a rhythm governed by the sun, the seasons, and, most importantly for our story tonight, by a single resonant sound. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you in the comments, and we can all share a moment of collective calm. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you stand there, just as the last glow of daylight fades, you feel it coming. You hear a low, sonorous sound begin to rumble from the church tower, a deep, slow clang of the great bell. This isn't a cheerful, celebratory ringing. It's a purposeful, almost solemn toll. Bong, bong, bong. This is the curfew bell. The word itself, curfew, comes to us from the old French couvre-feu, which literally translates to cover fire. That's right, you heard me. Cover fire. It's a beautifully simple, wonderfully direct command. And as it rings, you feel a gentle shift in the air, a collective intake of breath as the town prepares to go dark. The sounds of the street begin to fade. That last dog bark seems a little more urgent. The distant conversations cease abruptly. Every light in every window, a tiny point of comfort against the encroaching dark, is about to be extinguished. You watch as a neighbor on the street corner, who was just about to head into the local tavern, simply stops, sighs, and turns back toward his own home. He knows the rules. Everyone does. The bell tolls for everyone. And if you weren't already inside, it was your last chance to get there before the night claimed the streets, leaving them to the shadows and the few who held permission to be out in them. And it's a silence that truly descends, not like the sudden quiet of our modern cities, but a gradual hush that feels ancient. It was a quiet born not of modern comfort and electricity, but of necessity. You could almost feel the air growing colder, and you know, without a doubt, that your place is inside by the flickering warmth of a dying fire. As you pull the heavy wooden door shut and the clang of the curfew bell echoes in the air, you're enveloped by a sudden, comforting hush. That deep sound, the couvre-feu, wasn't just a medieval invention. It had a far longer, stranger history. It's easy to assume the Middle Ages just came up with everything on their own, but so much of it was built on a kind of strange, long-forgotten inheritance from empires long past. The very idea of a shared public time signal goes all the way back to ancient Rome. They had bells too, though not for putting out fires. The Romans used bells to mark the hours of the day, particularly in the city, to announce things like the opening of the public baths or the start of the day's market. So the medieval curfew bell was a new tune on a very old instrument, you could say. But the medieval version took on a completely different, and arguably much more serious role. Its most direct ancestor wasn't in Rome, but in the practice of the Normans after they conquered England in 1066. William the Conqueror, a man not known for his gentle disposition, is widely credited with formalizing the curfew law in England. He did this for a very practical reason that had absolutely nothing to do with being nice. He was a foreign conqueror and he knew that a rebellious population was most dangerous under the cover of darkness. The curfew was a way to make sure that people were in their homes, not planning rebellions or sneaking around causing trouble. You can imagine a medieval rebel sitting around his campfire and saying, "Right, we'll strike at midnight." And his friends saying, "Oh, hang on, mate. I've got to be home by the bell, remember? The sheriff will have my head." And honestly, the Normans were probably pretty successful with this. It's hard to plot a coup when you can't leave your house. This brings up a quirky tidbit. The curfew bell was also in some towns rung in the morning. This was the ignite fire bell, or the fire up bell, that told people it was safe to uncover their hearths and get the day started. Imagine having to wait for a church bell to tell you it was okay to make your morning tea. Now, that's a level of historical inconvenience that really puts our modern "the Wi-Fi is down" complaints into perspective. Historians still argue about whether the morning bell was as widespread as the evening one, but the concept shows just how much medieval life was regulated by these big, resonant public sounds. It was a kind of communal rhythm, a gentle but firm reminder that you were a part of a larger, orderly society, whether you liked it or not. The sound itself was often a point of pride for a town, a big, heavy piece of bronze that not only told time, but also announced the town's importance and stability. It was a kind of sonic hug that said, "Everything's okay, we're all going to bed now." And as you feel the warmth of your hearth on your face, the last echoes of the bell fade, and you know, deep in your bones, that it's time to sleep. With the curfew bell a fading memory, you turn your attention to the warm, flickering heart of your home, the hearth. The very word hearth feels cozy and ancient, doesn't it? This is where your family gathers. You see your wife carefully raking the last of the embers from the day's fire into a tight, smoldering pile. She then takes a heavy, dome-shaped lid made of clay or iron and places it over the top. This is the curfew in action, the literal cover fire that gave the bell its name. It's a simple but brilliant piece of technology, a medieval fire extinguisher, you could say. It was a crucial part of the curfew tradition, a way to prevent errant sparks from causing a devastating blaze in a town made almost entirely of wood and thatched roofs. You can almost smell the faint, dying scent of smoke and hear the soft hiss of the embers as they are sealed away for the night. The hours after the curfew bell were not for idleness, but for the peaceful, quiet tasks of domestic life. With the sounds of the outside world muffled and the rush of the day behind you, this was the time for quiet conversation and simple crafts. Your wife might be mending a tunic or spinning some wool by the light of a single tallow candle, its flame casting long dancing shadows on the mud walls. Perhaps your children are listening to a story, a familiar folktale of giants and brave knights. This was a time of community, even in the smallest of family units. It was a time to connect without the distractions of the outside world. But this period of quiet wasn't just about safety and domestic chores. It was also a time of quiet contemplation. Without electric lights or books, people's minds were free to wander. You might find yourself staring into the dying embers, thinking about the day's harvest or the long winter ahead. It's in these moments that we find a truly quirky tidbit about medieval life, the popularity of dream books. These were guides passed down by scribes that purported to interpret your dreams. While we might laugh at them today, to a person in the Middle Ages with so much of their life governed by unseen forces, the world of dreams felt just as real as the waking world. Historians still argue whether these books were considered serious divinatory tools or just a form of playful entertainment, a quiet way to pass the long hours of the night. You can imagine a tired farmer trying to recall his dream of a falling tooth and wondering if it meant a bad harvest or just that he needed to get to the tooth puller in town. These long, dark hours were filled with stories and superstitions, whispers and dreams. And as you feel your own eyelids grow heavy, you know it's time to join them in the darkness. The quiet of the house after the curfew bell was a form of protection, not just against fire, but against something far more sinister: crime. In a time before streetlights and police patrols as we know them, the night was a dangerous place. The curfew was, in a very practical sense, an act of community self-defense. By forcing everyone indoors, the authorities could easily spot anyone who was out after dark and immediately assume they were up to no good. You can imagine the local night watchman, a figure wrapped in a dark cloak and carrying a lantern, walking his rounds, his gaze sharp and his ears tuned for any sound that shouldn't be there. If he saw a figure moving in the shadows, he had every right to challenge them. And unless you had a very good reason to be out, like a medical emergency, you were in big trouble. The reasons for a curfew were actually a kind of historical Venn diagram of common sense and social control. On one hand, you had the very real threat of arson. In a town of tightly packed wooden buildings, a single stray spark could, and often did, wipe out entire neighborhoods. The Great Fire of London, though much later, is a testament to what happens when fires get out of control. By mandating the covering of fires, the curfew was literally saving lives. On the other hand, you had the issue of crime. Robbery was a constant threat, and darkness provided the perfect cover. The curfew was a way to make the streets less hospitable for thieves and vagabonds. It was a simple yet effective form of urban planning. A quirky, but very real, reason for a curfew in some towns was to prevent brawls. Medieval taverns, as you can imagine, were lively places. They were filled with drink, loud conversation, and occasionally violence. The curfew bell was the last call, the universal signal for everyone to go home before things got out of hand. You can almost hear a tavern owner leaning against his bar, sighing in relief as the bell rings, knowing his last drunken customer is stumbling out the door. Historians still debate just how effective the curfew was in preventing crime, but there's no doubt that it was the main tool for law and order after sunset for centuries. It was the only thing standing between a peaceful town and utter chaos. So, while you might find the idea of an enforced bedtime quaint or even annoying, for the people of the Middle Ages, it was a guarantee of safety. It was the sound that told you, it's okay, you're safe now. And as you pull a rough wool blanket up to your chin, you feel that safety deep in your bones, a sense of security that our modern world, with all its light, rarely provides. While the curfew bell was a tool for safety and fire prevention, it was also, as with so many seemingly benign laws, a powerful instrument of social control. This is where the gentle clang of the bell takes on a more serious political tone. In many places, the curfew was imposed by a conquering power on a newly subjugated population. It wasn't about a peaceful community going to bed. It was about a new ruler ensuring their dominion. For instance, in parts of what is now Scotland, the curfew was a Norman imposition on the native Anglo-Saxon population. It was a clear, audible sign that the old order was gone and a new one was in place. Every night, as that bell rang out, it was a reminder that you are no longer free to move as you pleased. This raises a peculiar and rather grim tidbit. In some towns, the bell ringer was not just a humble local. He was often a representative of the lord or the king, a kind of sonic constable who enforced the rule with his rope. It was a simple job, but one that carried immense weight and authority. The bell was the Lord's voice, booming out over the rooftops, telling everyone when to go to bed. You can imagine the quiet resentment that built up, the whispers in the dark about the new foreign law that made a whole town feel like children. It was a daily act of submission, a forced obedience that went to the very heart of medieval life. The curfew was, in a very real sense, a kind of psychological warfare. You can't plot a rebellion if you can't even meet with your co-conspirators. Historians still argue about the extent to which the curfew was truly about social control versus practical necessity. Was it a calculated move to keep the populace in line, or just a smart way to stop cities from burning down. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. The bell served both purposes beautifully. It was a fire alarm that also happened to be a political tool. The ringing was a symbol of order, whether that order was welcome or not. It brought a kind of peace to the night, but it was a peace that came at a cost, the loss of personal freedom after dark. And as you huddle by the dying fire, you are acutely aware of the weight of that sound, a sound that has echoed across generations, marking the end of the day and the beginning of a different, more constrained kind of quiet. Of course, not everyone was a fan of the curfew. The promise of the night was simply too tempting for some, and the punishment for breaking the curfew varied wildly depending on where you lived and who you were. The concept of a curfew breaker was a known archetype, a kind of lovable scamp or a genuine troublemaker, depending on the town's mood. In a quiet, sleepy town, getting caught might just mean a stern talking to from the constable and a fine. But in a larger city, the consequences could be much more severe. The punishments for being out after the bell were often creative, if not entirely humane. A quirky historical tidbit is the fact that some towns would punish repeated curfew breakers by forcing them to carry a heavy stone through the town square the next day, a kind of public shaming that was meant to be both humiliating and exhausting. You can almost see a tired villager, red-faced and sweating, trudging through the market with a boulder on his back, everyone whispering and pointing as he passes. And for those with a bit more money, the fine would simply increase. It was a kind of sliding scale of justice, where the penalty was less about the crime itself and more about how much money you had to pay to make it go away. It was a system that, in a lot of ways, sounds a lot like our modern world. But the night wasn't just for criminals. The curfew was often relaxed for people of a certain social standing, like the local lord or a visiting dignitary. This meant the streets weren't entirely empty. There might be the quiet clip-clop of a horse carrying a nobleman, or the hurried footsteps of a servant carrying an urgent message. These were the exceptions that proved the rule. A true mainstream historical fact is that the curfew laws were often written to have exceptions built in, allowing for essential travel or urgent business. It's not like the whole world just stopped dead. Historians still argue about the extent to which these laws were actually enforced in every town, every night. Was it just a law in the books, or was it something that was truly felt and obeyed by everyone? It was probably a mix of both. Some nights, the watchman might be a bit lax, but on others, he might be on the lookout for a rival from a nearby village. Either way, for the ordinary person, the sound of the bell was the final word. It meant the day was done, and the world outside was no longer your concern. It was a law written in sound, a law you could hear, and as the embers in your hearth turn to ash, you are grateful for the safety that this simple, ancient law provides. The curfew, as a ubiquitous and powerful force in daily life, couldn't last forever. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, and then to the Age of Enlightenment and beyond, its importance slowly began to fade. The reasons for its decline were as gradual and complex as the reasons for its rise. For one, towns and cities simply got bigger. It became harder and harder to enforce a law that required every single person to be indoors. With more people, you got more merchants, more travelers, and more people who had a legitimate reason to be out at night. A simple bell could no longer govern the complicated rhythm of a bustling urban center. A quirky fact about this decline is the rise of the night watchman as a paid, professional position rather than a citizen's duty. This was a slow but steady change. As towns became more sophisticated, they could afford to pay people to patrol the streets all night. This meant the general populace didn't need to be cooped up in their homes for fear of crime. The night was no longer a no man's land. It was a patrolled space. The invention of gas lamps and later, electric streetlights was the final nail in the curfew's coffin. Once the streets were bathed in light, The fear of the dark and the criminals who lurked in it began to wane. The need to cover fire was replaced by professional fire departments. The need to prevent crime was replaced by police forces. The job of the curfew bell, in a lot of ways, was simply outsourced. A mainstream historical fact is that while the curfew faded from daily life, it never truly disappeared. Curfew laws still exist in many places, though they are now typically aimed at minors and are a sign of a society's concern for juvenile safety rather than a tool for fire prevention or social control. Historians still argue whether the decline of the curfew marked a true increase in personal freedom or simply a change in how that freedom was policed. Did we lose a sense of communal rhythm in exchange for a more individualistic existence? Perhaps. The last ringing of a true medieval curfew bell was a quiet, unremarked event. It didn't happen on a specific day. It just slowly faded into a historical curiosity, a sound that only echoes now in the pages of history books. As we bring our journey to a close, you can feel that medieval town fading around you. The crackle of the fire, the rough feel of the wool blanket, the faint scent of wood smoke. It all begins to soften. The sounds of our own world, the hum of a refrigerator or the distant drone of a car, gently return. The idea of a world so governed by a single sound, so utterly dependent on the sun, feels very far away now. That was a time when the day's end wasn't a choice. It was a command. A quiet, gentle command to rest, to be safe, to let the world outside go dark for a while. And that's a beautiful thought, isn't it? A shared, collective sigh at the end of a long day. So as you settle in, let go of the anxieties of your own modern world and simply rest. The day is done. The town is quiet. And you are safe, just like they were so long ago.